Hi, can you guys hear me?
Hi, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I am going to set up the video. You should be able to see me there. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to refer to some page numbers. I think all of you can share the screen. If you want to, one of you could share the Ryle text. Does anyone want to do that? You can work it out amongst yourselves. Okay, I'm going to get started. Guys.
Sorry, I'm on a mobile device, so I can't share my screen, unfortunately.
Okay. Can anyone share their screen? Anyway, you can look at
I can.
So I'm not very good at this teaching face-to-face thing. I've sort of forgotten my blackboard marker. Does anyone happen to have one? Otherwise, I'll have to do it without. No one stole a blackboard marker in a previous incarnation. Okay, so okay, so today we're going to talk about Ryle. So, oops. I'm sharing the screen. And I gave you two chapters of Ryle's concept of mind. The concept of mind was published immediately after the Second World War, or 4 years afterwards. So it's post-war Oxford philosophy. Last week we talked about, or yesterday's class, we talked about philosophical behaviorism. And I sort of suggested that philosophical behaviorism is motivated by concerns in philosophy of language. And so philosophical behaviorism, as it's sort of canonically taught and canonically represented, is a thesis about meaning. Yeah, the claim is that these behaviorists, these philosophical behaviorists, were motivated by the sort of verificationist idea that the meaning of an expression has to be tied to its means of verification. And so to understand the meaning, there's an epistemic side to meaning. Yeah, that the meaning of an expression is tied to what would count as evidence for it. Yeah, you can't understand something that you can't have direct evidence for. Yeah, and so the idea was that mental language can't refer to inner mental states because they're not possible things that can be experienced and count towards the verification of the expression. Now, this is the sort of standard way that behaviorism is understood. And this ties behaviorism to logical positivism. So in the 1930s, you had this movement, well, 1920s and 1930s, influenced by the early Wittgenstein, that and started off in Vienna. Many of the people associated with the logical positivism in the Vienna Circle were either Jews or radical leftists. And so many of them fled from the Nazis after the rise of the Nazis in the 30s. And many of them went to America. So you have these logical positivists who went to America, became quite dominant. This became sort of dominant post-war philosophy in the USA. Some of them came to Istanbul. So probably one of the most important philosophers of science in the logical positive group was Reichenbach. Anyone heard of Reichenbach? And he set up the philosophy department in Istanbul University. He was brought in by Ataturk, who was like, looked at the Nazis and was like, well, Jews are clever. I'll have them. Yeah, so Ataturk basically accepted a bunch of academic refugees in Turkey in the 1930s. including a bunch of, including Reichenbach. And so the logical positivists had these theories about meaning, tying meaning to verification. For those of you in my history of philosophy class, anyone taking 314 with me? Yeah, I think there's a bunch of you. So when we look at Wittgenstein and the Tractatus, we'll see the kind of prehistory of logical positivism. And in Oxford, this is where Ryle was, the logical positivism was kind of becoming a hit. The main centre of logical positivism, though, in Oxford was A.J. Ayer. So you may have heard of Ayer. He's the sort of person who sort of popularised logical positivism in the UK. He's got a bunch of books aimed at students that are quite readable. So if you want to know a bit about logical positivism, I would write his name on the board for A.J. Ayer. He was at Wadham, which was my college at Oxford. And we'll talk a bit about Oxford later when we talk about Ryle and the foreigner, the Turk who goes to Oxford and gets confused. Yeah, this is something. Who's read the Ryle? Who read all of it? Okay. Yeah, I mean, try to push on with it. I think Ryle was quite fun. Did people enjoy it? It's quite readable. And I think the stuff in the first chapter is the most famous stuff. It's the stuff that everyone is in all the anthologies. I think the second chapter, though, is really fun. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in the second chapter that I think is very relevant today. That when we move on to looking at more contemporary stuff, that his views about inner speech, I think, we're going to read a kind of contemporary take on the Rylean position about what inner. He's got this view that inner speech is just, and the stream of consciousness is just repressed outer speech, which is a very sort of plausible and a view that I think now many people hold, and we'll talk a bit about that. Yeah, so Ryle wasn't at Wadham, he was at Oxford, and I think I don't know if you read this, but one thing is the sort of canonical version you got of philosophical behaviorism that we found in Hyle. When you read Ryle, you don't really see much of that. Like doesn't seem to be motivated by concerns about meaning. Yeah, and I think that's right. So I think that Ryle, it's really a mistake to think of Ryle as a sort of canonical philosophical behaviorist who's motivated by questions about meaning. If he's not motivated about meaning, what motivates him to reject the Cartesian picture? Any thoughts? If the concerns aren't semantic, what are his concerns?
Methodological.
Well, yeah, he's got some methodological concerns. And remember that in the Hyle chapter, we've got this idea that logical behaviorists and classical philosophical behaviorists are motivated by semantic concerns. In the philosophy of science, in psychology, you have these sort of methodological behaviorists who are motivated by the concerns of what sort of methodology of proper science should be engaged in. But I'm not so sure that he's motivated by these. I mean, he's got some methodological issues, but I don't think his motivation has really coming from the philosophy of science in the way. What sort of things does he care about? I'm just wondering what. I've got my answer, but you might tell me something that's surprising, and I'm like, oh yeah. So yeah, and we've got a couple of
About the concept, logical self. Do you think that they are falsely divided?
Yeah, I think he thinks that. I mean, there is some worry about some sort of fallacies involved in the behaviorist account, but then which one?
I think this idea that the external worlds, the workings of external worlds should be considered as a model for workings of internal world also, and it's because this he gives a metaphor that university is not something like church or etc. another building, but university is something that is that involves many other buildings.
Yes, so
I think he tells that our mind is not like I mean physical object, but they are, I mean, Cartesian view supports support this idea, like it's the location, it's the place.
Yeah, so he appeals to this idea that the Cartesians are making a category mistake. So one of the things he does in the introduction is he offers a bunch of diagnoses of what attracts people to the Cartesian position. And you may think by these sort of diagnoses may help undermine it. He also thinks that the Cartesian, from his perspective, the Cartesians make a category mistake. Now, I'm not sure that's really an argument against Cartesianism. I think that the Cartesians would just say, no, it's not a category mistake. You've really got these two substances. Yeah. And then the question with the Cartesian becomes, is it a category mistake or not? Yeah. So just saying there's a category mistake, I think kind of Ryle's, when you read it, you think, yeah, it does. Maybe you're kind of attracted by it. You can be attracted to this non-Cartesian position. And then when he tells you it's a category mistake, you might think, yes. But I think the Cartesian response to the category mistake thing is just, well, no, it's not a category mistake.
Because Ryle already assumed the ontological concept, right?
Yeah, I mean, you had a point. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I feel like he believes that Cartesians are a bit lazy because they know the physicality and they just define the mind by what it's not. So they don't go ahead and defining the mind, but they just say it's everything the body is not.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is analogous to the sort of criticism that he offers a diagnosis of what's driving the Cartesian picture. So we've got a sort of genealogical argument, yeah, where one of the arguments is this genealogical one, where we look at what led to the emergence of the Cartesian picture and what's driving it. And then in some sense, when you see where it comes from, it's like, well, that's a bit silly. Yeah. So I do think, yeah, he does have these sort of genealogical arguments, and this is in the third section, or the final section, the third section of the first chapter, where he does this sort of story about the origin of Cartesianism. And they start off with the conception of the physical, and then you've got this mental stuff that can't somehow be fitted into this mechanistic picture. And then they basically say it's like the physical, except it's not. The non-physical, you just added a bunch of negative predicates, and then you say you've got this stuff that is sort of causal, but is defined purely in negation to the physical. So this is a sort of genealogical type of argument, which I think definitely you're right, that this is one of his lines of attacks. And I guess these sort of genealogical attacks can be quite plausible, because if you see the origin of something and it's got a dirty origin, you might be like, oh, yeah. But I think there's something else though that's really driving him. The logical positivists are driven by sort of semantic issues. Yeah.
While reading the chapter, I always associated the word mind with subject experience.
Yeah.
But then I realized that maybe it's talking about not the subject experience, but psychology, or all of the mental processes that the psychology is trying to, the science of psychology is trying to investigate and explore. So I was just gonna ask a big point, I mean, because if we think that mind refers to subjective experience, it becomes a much different thing, and then if it refers to any psychological thing, then it refers to another thing. So I was just wondering which interpretation is more correct.
Yeah, so I think Ryle is going to sort of sidestep that issue and try not to answer your question. Yeah, which you might think, hold on a minute, that's not right. But maybe this idea of subjective experience, maybe these are all these abstract concepts, and he's going to say, no, I'm more interested in sort of lived stuff. And from the lived perspective, my mind has got to do, even from the first person perspective, it's got to do with all these particular types of things. But I do think that, I think what Ryle would say about subjective experience is that according to the Cartesian picture, subjective experience involves these sort of subjective objects. You've got subjective states that are essentially private, where there's a sort of object of subjective experience. So the Cartesian account of subjective experience is going to be an account that understands subjective experience in terms of inner private states. So this, this is a view that when we look at Russell, okay, this is the wrong class. In my Russell, he has this idea of knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. And then we have the objects of subjective experience, which are sense data, which are the kind of subjective experiences. This is a view that goes back through the modern tradition, back to Descartes, and in the early modern, in the British empiricists, we have the idea of ideas. So the objects of consciousness are ideas, and ideas are private inner states. Yeah, so we have these subjective inner experiences. We have the objective physical world. The physical world causes us to have experiences, and the objects of subjective experience are in a subjective state. One of Ryle's most famous students, Dennett, talks about the kind of Cartesian theatre. We're in this little theatre, and there's an eye inside the mind, looking at what's going on in the private theatre. And what's going on in the private theatre is caused by the external world. So when you're talking about subjective experience, I think that Ryle's going to say, well, there's no such thing as subjective experience if what you mean by it is this Cartesian picture. Yeah? What you mean by it is the projection of sense data inside this inner private sphere. I take it, though, that he thinks that there is subjective experience. But subjective experience is going to be something like the point of view of an animal in the world. Yeah? And so one thing is that I think that a lot of the philosophical behavior, the canonical philosophical behaviorism, is a sort of reductive project that sort of wants to reduce the mental to the physical, and sort of say we can translate everything mental into a sort of physical vocabulary. I'm not sure that Ryle's really kind of driven by those sort of concerns. Yeah, so he's not worried about kind of being a hardcore physicalist who wants to, so I mean, I think there's room in Ryle for something like a subjective point of view, but he's going to reject subjectivity understood in terms of positing the existence of objects, of inner states of the object of the subjective experience. I think that Ryle is sort of attracted to a certain adverbialism. So we're animals that interact with the environment. There's a how we interact, yeah, and the sort of phenomenal aspect of experience, the redness of the colors here are an aspect of how I'm experiencing it. And so what you've got is you've got the animal, the thing in the world, you've got the activity of experiencing, and yeah, the how, I think, is something that is not essentially private. Yeah? I think there is going to be a problem that when you ask him how do we understand subjective experience, he's going to deny it in terms of the kind of classical modern idea that subjective experience has its own objects, which are states, so inner states, ideas, sense data, or what you like. Okay, so none of you gave the answer that I would have given. Oh,
I'm going to add on what you
yeah.
said, but that could kind of like maybe clarify it for me. I think we
Yeah.
did. So like the internalization of the external speech is actually like how the privacy of my inner states are overcome and like shared within the environment. So it is like an extension of it, but I think Ryle is not trying to have a reductionist point of view where you clash one into the other. But I don't know how he will like merge it, because it's usually done with like embodiment or like movement and like action taking. I don't
Yeah.
know the right position.
Okay, so good. So my answer, I'm going to come to this, and the second half of what I'm going to say is going to be directly on that. From what I've given you to read, I think there are two kind of essential motivators of Ryle. One of them is epistemic. Yeah, so the question isn't about, he's not so much concerned with offering a theory of the meaning of our mentalist vocabulary, but the fact that we just have no problem accessing the mentality of others. Yeah, and I think he's not really motivated by a theory of meaning, by a theory of recognition. Yeah, so I'm able to recognize when other people are happy, sad, and the like. I'm able to recognize when someone's doing something funny. I'm able to recognize when people are doing things on purpose. Yeah, and we have absolutely no problem doing this. Now there is a linguistic side of this, that we're perfectly capable of applying mentalistic vocabulary to others. Yeah, so there's a sort of, but Ryle doesn't seem to be really driven by questions about the theory of meaning. He's more driven by epistemic questions about the fact that we're able to recognize the mentality of others. Yeah, so I take it, unlike the logical positivist, that the sort of driving force, at least in chapter 1, has got to do with epistemic issues rather than semantic issues. Questions about our capacities for knowledge rather than meaning. And the sort of the thing I think he's finds most problematic about the Cartesian view of the mental is its privacy. Yeah, that mental states are somehow essentially private. And he's going to offer an account according to which mental states can be private sometimes, but the privacy of the mental is not its essential aspect. And this comes to the question about the relationship between inner speech and outer speech. The inner speech, the inner monologue, is just outward speech that's been repressed. Yeah, and so there's nothing essentially private about thinking. Thinking aloud and thinking silently are just two ways to do the same thing. Yeah, and so the fact that you're doing it silently is not a defining feature of thinking. Yeah, and this comes to the point you were raising. What's your name again? So yeah, when I point to you, why don't you tell me your names? Because I've forgotten how to remember people's names after 2 years of looking at little name tags. Maybe I'll be better at remembering names now that I see you once a week on Zoom. And yeah, so the Begum's question in chapter 2, I don't know if you got to chapter 2, but chapter 2 is an attack on what he calls the intellectualist tradition. Yeah, and I think the second thing that's driving Ryle is an attack on what he calls the intellectualist tradition. And so in philosophy, we may distinguish between the theoretical and the practical, between what Ryle calls knowing that and knowing how. And the traditional view is that some sort of knowing that is prior to know how. That sort of theory is prior to practice. Yeah, belief is prior to action. Yeah, that somehow rational, intelligent action presupposes some prior theoretical grasp. Yeah, and one of the things he's going to attack is this sort of Kantian view. Well, I've got a paper where it's not the Kantian view, but the view many people attribute to Kant that says action involves acting on a maxim, on a principle. So first of all, you recognize the principle and then you apply it. So the principle is something that can be understood theoretically. Yeah, and then rational action involves recognizing theoretically a principle and then acting upon it. And this is something that Ryle is really driven against. That somehow he's attracted to the view that the practical has to be prior to the theoretical. Yeah, and one of the areas where this is going to be most important is in language. Yeah, so the sort of intellectualist is going to say, first of all, you think what you have. The intellectual, and he thinks that intellectualism leads to an infinite regress. So, kind of, if the intellectualist is right, it's first you have to think what you're going to say, and then you say it. But thinking internally is itself an action. So kind of, in order to think what you're going to say, you first of all have to think about what you think you're going to say, and it goes all the way back. And if you're able to think what you're going to say before you say it, and if there's no problem with that action, why can't you just say what you want to say? Yeah, boom, like that. Yeah, so when I'm talking now, I've got some idea where I'm going, I've got some guideposts, but it's not like I first of all consciously have the sentence there in front of me, yep, and then say it. So saying it in a silent inner voice and then saying it aloud doesn't solve any explanatory problem, because you've got to explain how are you able to say it in this inner voice without thinking it beforehand. Yeah, so sort of Ryle thinks that the capacity to act is prior, that the practical is prior to the theoretical. But once again, well, for those of you in my philosophy class, this sounds a lot like Hegel. And we were talking about this at the end of yesterday in about Hegel. That did you ask me the question? Yeah. So I was going to say, when we look at what Ryle is going to offer us an account of why we might want to be Hegelian. Yeah, Ryle is like the father of, really, he was the editor of Mind, he's Mr. Analytic Philosophy in the UK. I think it's quite Hegelian. He was, I think, the first person in English to write a review of Sein und Zeit of Heidegger. Yeah, so, and there's some quite Heideggerian stuff in some ways. This whole sort of embodied cognition, that the theoretical, the idea that we give this privilege to theoretical reason and think that the intelligence is essentially a matter of theorizing. Yeah, and his view is that the theorizing is just kind of one of many aspects of action. Thinking theoretically is just one of the many things that we can do. Yeah, and I think this, once again, you asked about subjectivity. I think once again, I think he's going to think that many of these ways of thinking about subjectivity are coming from the intellectualist position. Yeah, where we think of intelligence, of thought, of subjectivity in terms of theorizing. Yeah, when we think that primarily when we have an action first philosophy, yeah, if we take action, embodied action as primary, then in some sense, some of the worries we may have about subjectivity may disappear. We may think of subjectivity as just an aspect of a certain type of activity. That our perception is perspectival, for example. That just seems to be an aspect of our kind of our embodied activity. Yeah, and you might think, well, if one of the kind of things about subjectivity is going to be its perspectival nature, I think something like that bit of subjectivity, I don't think we're going to have a particular problem with. There's going to be things like inwardness, but the Ryle's got an idea that the private, public, inner, outer things, well, now you might think the big problem is going to be with things like sensation. Yeah, and it's not obvious what Ryle is going to tell us about sensation. This is something that we'll be looking at later. Yeah.
I just don't understand why, in an attempt to like merge two together, we have to have like a monistic point of view. Because I think Ryle is kind of like saying that no such thing as like soul substance exists or like mind substance exists. So he's kind of a monist. But I think that why can't we say that in the Cartesian view that there are times in which these acts actually interact, like nothing, it's not solely Cartesian, but like there's this two parallel lines that continue, and then your body is you and your mind is also you, but one is not really can be explained via the another, because walking inside and talking from the outside is two different phenomenological things, and you do implement them in different ways for different occasions, so they are serving different purposes.
Yeah, I mean, on page 12, with page 12, we've got a page reference. What, finally? Yeah. So in page 12, he sort of says that both idealism and materialism are answers to an improper question. Yes, I think you're saying he's a monist, and I mean, I just think it's just sidestep that question. So are you a materialist? No. Are you a dualist? No. Yeah. Are you an idealist? No. So one thing is that I talk about logical positivism, and I think the behaviorism as we've seen it, the kind of classical explication of logical behaviorism, is really logical positivism. That Ryle was a sort of ordinary language philosopher. Yeah, so he was one of the leaders of this kind of Oxford ordinary language philosophy, him, Austin, and that they looked at how we use language in practice, even sort of in micro detail. And so in some sense, they're against, these sort of ordinary language philosophers are against sort of grand theory. Yeah, that we've got this bit of language, and this you find in Wittgenstein as well. So in Wittgenstein, he only talks about these different language games. Yeah, but we have to look at the language game we're in. Ryle isn't so much languagey like the later Wittgenstein. He's not so ideological. But I think one thing about Ryle is I think he's against. You might think he's sort of against this sort of grand theorizing. Yeah, so. When it comes to things about the mental, we've got different things we're able to do the logical positivists were into this sort of ideal language philosophy. Yeah, so they've got Russell and Wittgenstein and Frege invented modern logic. Yeah, so we got this new modern logic, and then it's like, let's try and say everything we can just using this modern logic. Yeah, and let's try to translate everything in English into logic. Yeah, so, and this ideal language will give us this unified scientific, philosophical kind of perspective of what there is. Yeah, so there's a single language we can express everything in, and it's all clean and it's all logical. I think Ryle is more into this sort of pluralism. Yeah, so does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, okay, what time is it now? I can't see my,
35.
okay, 35. So I've been talking a lot about Ryle in general. We haven't looked at the text. And we've mainly talked about stuff in the first chapter. So now I just want to run through and look at some quotes. For those of you who've done the reading, it might be a bit boring. But actually, I think once again, it's good for memory. Yeah, just to run through them in class. There may have been things that you've missed. Does anyone have a hard copy with them? Yeah, so if people have hard copies, do people fancy reading things themselves? Or I don't want to pick on the people with hard copies. Okay, so he starts off by introducing what he calls the official doctrine, what he takes to be the Cartesian position, the official theory. He calls this kind of sarcastically, what does he call it? The myth of the ghost in the machine. I think it's quite cool. He has some nice terminologies. I like Ryle. I think he writes quite nicely, and he's got a bunch of quite nice expressions and terms of phrase. I take it that according to this official doctrine that he doesn't like, the Cartesian position, this is on bottom of page 28. Do you want to read this? Human bodies are in space.
Human bodies are in space and are subject to mechanical laws which govern all other bodies in space. Bodily processes and states can be inspected by external observers. So, a man's bodily life is as much a public affair as are the lives of animals and reptiles, and even as the careers of trees, crystals, and plants.
Yep, that's the body, and then the mind.
No?
Yeah, come on.
But minds are not in space, nor are their operations subject to mechanical laws. The workings of one mind are not witnessable by other observers. Its theory is private. Only I can take direct cognizance of states and processes of my own mind. A person therefore lives through two collateral histories, one consisting of what happens in and to his body, the other consisting of what happens in and to his mind. The first is public, the second is private. The events in the first history are events in the physical world. Those in the second are events in the mental world.
Yeah. So this is his kind of characterization of Cartesianism. It was interesting. Descartes doesn't put it in. Descartes pushes it in these more metaphysical terms. I think this sort of follows from the perspective that we have a distinction between the public and the private. And this sort of distinction is hashed out once again. It's an epistemic notion. It's got to do with what's witnessable, what's perceivable. Yeah. When I'm using epistemic, I'm counting stuff in the philosophy of perception as what we're able to recognize, what we're able to witness. So we have direct access, epistemic, direct access to our own mental states. We have access to the bodies maybe of others, and then that's it. But our access to the mental states of others isn't through perception, there's no direct access, it's through inference. We have to infer the mental lives of others. And I take it kind of Ryle's big problem with this is that we don't have any problems recognizing the mentality of others. Yeah, and he starts off not by, today when people talk about mind, we think about beliefs and desires. We think about attributing beliefs and desires to others. Yeah, so often today, if you're looking at the philosophy of mind, when people are talking about our knowledge of other minds, it's got to do with belief attribution, desire attribution. Ryle, I think, does think that when it comes to understanding the mentality of others, belief and desire attribution isn't really central. So what are the sort of things he takes to involve our witnessing of the mentality of others? What sort of things,
Well, we are able to differentiate the rational from the irrational. We have
Yeah, so whether someone's doing something intentionally, whether someone's doing something, if someone's being witty, yeah, so recognizing that someone's being funny, now we might think, hold on a minute, is that really mental state attribution? Well, it's not really mental state attribution, but it's when we say this, we're expressing something that involves a recognition of the intelligence of others. Yeah, we don't think well, Alexa, do we sometimes think Alexa is witty? I don't know. But when we listen to it, when we understand the meaning of someone's words, yeah, and we understand what they're saying is meaningful, and we recognize what they're saying is meaningful, that this involves sort of recognizing the other as an intelligent agent. Yeah. So he's not so much, I think, interested in belief and desire attribution. And as we go through, we'll have a look. But I take it his thought is that it's just obvious that we're capable of witnessing, of recognizing the mentality of others. Yeah. And this isn't a question about the meaning of our mentalistic vocabulary. It's a question of what we're able to recognize. And he appeals to our mentalistic vocabulary. But I think the point isn't, he's not really driven by concerns about the meaning of the terms, but just that we don't have any problem applying this vocabulary. We're able to apply this vocabulary without any problem. Why? Because we're capable of recognizing the mentality of others. Yeah. And that means the mentality of others can't be understood in Cartesian terms, because according to the Cartesian, there'd be no way of explaining this. And so what? Oh, you had a question?
This is like attributing my mental states to others. I think it can be explained in Cartesian terms because there is a psychological theory of mind, like how we can understand beliefs and desires and knowledge of others. And this is the physical thing, and it's a social thing. And like for example, there are people with like autism, for example, like who are unable to do that. So like I cannot understand why he says that like our ability to understand other minds is like does not comply with the Cartesian view, because like I feel like it's not a mental, it's not a like a magical thing, it's not a magical process of our understanding our minds. It's also another physical thing, just a bit more complex.
Yeah, you have an answer. I've got an answer as well. But yeah.
Not an answer, but a related
Okay.
concern, I guess, because I felt the same, and an example I thought was we can do the same, to animals. I feel like we can see when a dog is happy. We can, a fair amount of time see. Well, I mean, we think that we know that he's doing something with intention, but I don't think Descartes would think, our mind is, same as a, an animal. So what would Descartes say? What is different, or what would Ryle say to Descartes? What is different that we can see?
Yeah. So I think Ryle is committed to a view about our capacity to understand others that we might think of, some people call the direct perception view, that we're able to perceive the certain aspects of the mental life of others. Yeah, so it's not a matter of it's not a matter of inference, it's a matter of perception. And I think that's basically, and I think he thinks that our everyday language suggests that we have this direct perceptual access to the mental lives of others, and that he doesn't think there's an asymmetry between self-knowledge and other knowledge when it comes to the application of the mental. Yeah, and so I take it, because I'll come to you in a second. I just want to finish up. Just want to say one thing in reply, and I'll come to you. I take it though, yeah. So he thinks that the Cartesian is left with thinking that we can only attribute mental states to others as a matter of inference. And then it seems to me that there are two main strategies you might have for this inference. You've got the argument by analogy, yeah, that well, this animal is behaving like I behave. When I behave like this, I have this experience. Yeah, so we've got an argument by analogy. Another type of argument is going to be something like inference-based explanation. That attributing mental states to others, like beliefs and desires, is a matter of theory construction. So we develop a theory of beliefs and desires being the causes of action, and then we apply this theory to explain the behaviors of others. And the reason we're committed to it is because it's a successful theory. And then if we're a scientific realist, we say when we have a successful theory, we don't just use the theory instrumentally, but we believe in the entities posited by the theory. So we believe in quarks because we've got a theory that explains what we can see, and we posit the existence of quarks to explain this, and we posit the existence of beliefs and desires as inner states to explain the behavior of others, and it's a perfectly good theory. Yeah, cool. This is the view we're going to be looking at when we look at Sellers. So Sellers is the originator of this theory, the 1950s, which was then taken up in psychology. So I think there are things that well, Sellers isn't a Cartesian, but you could be a Selesian Cartesian. Yeah, you could just say, well, we've got this theory, it's a perfectly good theory, and it explains behavior, and this theory posits the existence of, yeah. And I think that if you're going to be a Rylean, so I'm sympathetic to a bunch of what Ryle says, but I think with beliefs and desires, a belief desire explanation, something like theory might be right, but there's a whole bunch of the mental that Ryle focuses on that I think isn't best understood in terms in scientific theories, we posit the existence of unobservable entities to explain the behavior of entities that we do observe. I think with belief desire explanation, that might be a plausible way of thinking about how we go about attributing beliefs and desires to others. I think for the sort of things that Ryle's talking about, I don't think it's best thought of in those terms. So we might have one theory for beliefs and desires, another theory for a whole bunch of other stuff that may be more perceptual. So I think when you see the pain or the anger of someone, I think, yeah, maybe, yeah, but I do think there are these options that the Cartesians got. Yeah, but I'm not sure how plausible they are as a kind of overall account of the recognition of the mental. Yeah.
So you mentioned the ordinary language
Yeah.
philosophers and Ryle as well.
Yeah.
And I think you also said that Ryle is not a logical behaviorist, but something else.
I mean, Ryle is often a trip, you know, when people talk about logical behaviorism, Ryle is often one of the people they list. Ryle and Wittgenstein are often classified as kind of the two main, and a lot of people think no, but they're not.
Yeah. So I have this interesting connection that when I was taking Chris's class last semester, Chrissy, she was teaching later Wittgenstein. She insisted heavily that later Wittgenstein wasn't a behaviorist as well. But now I'm having hard time to see how they are not logical behaviorists. As you said that logical behaviorism is the translation of mental from to non-mental, and I think in later Wittgenstein you have the or in the ordinary language you have the mental terms as just in the public and not referring to anything.
Yeah, but
As an object.
I mean, is he really? I mean, some people do interpret Ryle as a logical behaviorist. Yeah, so there are definitely ways of reading Ryle as a logical behaviorist. My kind of reason for thinking, for resisting that a bit, has got to do with kind of his concerns about knowledge. And really what seems to be driving him is the idea that we're able to recognize, it's our recognitional capacities. We've got these recognitional capacities to recognize the mental lives of others. And then our evidence for this is our capacity to apply mentalistic language. So the stuff about language is being used as evidence for the existence of these recognitional capacities. Yeah, our capacity to recognize the mental lives of others. Yeah. And so I take it that the reason I'm saying perhaps it's a mistake to lump him as a logical behaviorist is that the semantic thing about, you know, he doesn't seem to buy into a verificationist semantics. Yeah. And it's not obvious that his thesis is really about the meaning of pain language. Yeah. I mean, the logical behaviorists, we've got sense and reference, and that they want to say that we're offering account of the meaning of these terms. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think he says that theorizing about things is also a part of intelligence. Like our intelligence capacities are directly tied to our theories about stuff, etc. So would he say that the capacity to understand others' mental states is also tied to intellectual capacity? I mean, our intelligence. So some of us understand others' mental states as better or not. So there is so in this way, he's not a mere behaviorist who is who thinks only the behavioral part.
So one thing I'd say to that is he doesn't, as far as I know, well, I haven't read all of Ryle, and this isn't something he says, but I think something a Rylean could say is that recognizing if you're going to be an anti-intellectualist, if you're going to be a sort of, I mean, there's this sort of pragmatist side where we're putting action before understanding, we're putting the capacity to act as central. You might think understanding others involves knowing how to interact with them appropriately. Yeah, so you say something to me, Yeah, what is it for me to understand your sentence? Well, it's sort of to know how to go on. It's to know how to respond appropriately. Yeah. So understanding someone else's language. The intellectualist is going to say, oh, what that involves is theoretically understanding the content. Yeah. You know, this utterance is a proposition. Yeah. Understanding it involves intellectually grasping the proposition. Whereas you might think someone who's more action-based may think that understanding what someone says involves knowing how to go on. And you were in the Wittgenstein class, I'm using kind of Wittgensteinian language here. So I think in some sense, the pragmatist side of both Wittgenstein and Ryle, I think pushes against their sort of logical behaviorism. The logical behaviorists sort of put theoretical understanding first. Yeah. And I think both Ryle and Wittgenstein have this action first base. Like understanding a proposition is understanding how to continue.
So it doesn't become semantic, more action based.
Yeah, yeah. So I've got three questions. Oh, okay.
What I try to mean is that if we think that our capacity can change about understanding others, so there is something other than behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, he obviously thinks that there is intellectual stuff.
Yeah.
But the theoretical, yeah.
You know, it's all external. It's all external. It's already there, not there. So, but this view is different in that way.
Maybe. Yeah. So we're gonna have a break. We had 3 other questions. So yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, if not Wittgenstein and Ryle, who would be, in your opinion, a canonical representative of logical behaviorism?
Oh my God. I think there's a bunch of sort of logical positivists whose names I have forgotten. Is there a quote? Let me. Yeah. So, oops. So, for example, is this? Oh no, this was. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of sort of logical positivists who kind of put forward views like this. So when you had the verification principle, people in the 1930s applying the verification principle to questions of other minds. I mean, one thing about logical positivists though is that in the 1930s, I think most of them were idealists in some sense. So Carnap, for example, thinks in the Aufbau has this idea that the world is constructed out of sense data. So he offers an account of the meaning of all of our language, and all you've got is sense data and logic. Yeah, so the sort of and they're offering a reductionist account, but they're getting rid of the external and just saying we can explain everything in terms of logical constructions out of sense data. So the logical positivists tended to not be materialists, in that they started off with sense data. So but there was some, I think, some of the logical positivists, when they went to America, were playing around with this behaviorism. And I have some names in my head, but they're not coming to me. But there definitely were some of these people taking the verification principle and applying it to behavior. But yeah, this wasn't the standard logical positivist view either. Yeah, I don't know if you know Carnap, who's one of the leading, after Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein, he has this logical construction of the world. But he starts off not with behavior, but with sense data. So yeah, I don't think that this philosophical behaviorism, it's difficult to see how central it was, because Wittgenstein and Ryle are not exactly it. I think there are a bunch of people in America influenced by Carnap, but then didn't want to go idealistic, then did the same sort of thing, but starting off with behavior and thinking we can kind of construct all our language on the basis of logic and behavior.
I just thought that maybe Ryle is a bit like nonsense, especially in the sense that like you have to have the knowledge for the like how like for example Chomsky thinks that you should have the formal capacity to understand language first in order to speak language, like because it's not like stimulus and response, etc. So maybe like his knowledge about how you need to have to you need to be able to go on first. It's kind of like that. Right?
Well, I mean, so Chomsky kind of has this Cartesian side to him as well, though.
Yeah, not exactly like
Yeah.
but easier for me to understand that.
So yeah, we need to have a break, but like, yeah, one thing about Chomsky though, then we'll have 10 minutes from whenever. Yeah. One thing about Chomsky is that Chomsky, I think, does posit internal representations, but these representations are not conscious.
Yeah.
So I think one thing about Ryle is that today the sort of standard view is we've got all these internal mental states that are representational. So what's the mark of the mental? What is it that makes something mental? And I think if you ask Ryle, according to the Cartesian tradition, the mark of the mental is consciousness. Yeah, I would say today, if you ask a philosopher what's the mark of the mental, they'd say intentionality, about representational content. So mental states are states that have representational content. Now, you can then have sort of representational states, mental states, that are completely subpersonal and non-conscious. Yeah, and I take it that sort of Chomsky and his committee, well, probably committed to these sort of grammatical representations that are prior to the performance. Yeah, so you have sort of representational structure. Now you might say, well, what it is though, that if you wanted to be a more embodied Rylean Chomskyan, you could say that the grammatical structure is just kind of, it's not to do with the structure of the activity. So every activity is structured, has certain limits. Yeah, it's not like in order to have a structured activity, you first of all need a representation of the structure, and then but activities can kind of have structure, and you can think of construction. You can think of structure as something like constraints on activity. Yeah, and so if you're thinking of structure in terms of constraints, you don't need to have a kind of prior representation of the structure, but the structure sort of emerges as the activity unfolds. If you're taking Uzi's class, this idea of the importance of constraints, I don't know if he talks about that, but I think the sort of, so you might think of things like grammatical structure, not necessarily entailing the pre-existence of a representation of the structure. Yeah.
But this is a non-Chomsky view of grammatical.
Well, yeah. It's except
Chomsky,
except though.
radically opposed that view from.
Well, a Chomskyan, you could buy into Chomskyan linguistics. Yeah. You could say that we've got these internal grammars that are kind of that we all, they're universal. But how these grammars are embodied is in terms of just constraints. Yeah. So I think there's a way of.
That's a logical possibility, but
Yeah.
probably Chomsky himself would oppose that view.
Yeah, I mean Chomsky himself is more Cartesian.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think to be a Chomskyan, that you could be a Chomskyan and combine the idea that there's some sort of universal grammar with the idea that this grammar is best understood in terms of a system of constraints that then emerges. So I think that, yeah. Okay, so let's have a break.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Oh, okay. Oops. How do I? So let's get started again. Yeah, so I've sort of said a lot about Ryle. So we've got the idea that the characteristic element of, oops, I'm back. Hello, can you hear me again? Did I turn on? Okay.
Yes, everything's okay.
Can you, is that better? Am I more, yeah. Yeah, so he thinks that we have a problem explaining, the Cartesian has a problem explaining how we can know the minds of others, to which the Cartesian may reply, no, we can know the minds of others either through an argument by analogy. So we have this was a classic answer to the problem of other minds, or through some sort of inference to the best explanation. That our application of mental predicates to others is a matter of inference to best explanation. It's a sort of scientific hypothesis. I think Ryle, the problem he has with this is I think Ryle just thinks, but it's not like that. Yeah, we don't have to jump through these hoops. We are quite capable of recognizing the mentality of others. Now, of course, the Cartesian could go and say, well, you know, little babies are scientists and they do all their scientific theorizing when they're babies and can't remember it. And by the time you reach adulthood, you've got very good theories, and you're very good at making judgments using these theoretical terms. So I think there's stuff the sort of Cartesian alternative could say. I do think though that there's a sort of, I think Brian was just going to say it's not like that. So maybe this is a kind of bit of a pure phenomenology. Yeah, but our relationships to others isn't inferential in this way. I like what he says on page 5. So he said, even if he prefers to believe that to other human bodies there are harnessed minds not unlike our own. So this is on page 5. Even if we've got some evidence, even if we think, well, we have got reasons to apply this, he cannot claim to be able to discover their individual characteristics or the particular things that they undergo and do. Absolute solitude is on this showing the inelucible destiny of the soul. Only our bodies compete. Yeah. And if you read people like Russell, you know, this is how Russell sees the world, that the Cartesianism pushes you towards this sort of solipsism. Actually, our relationships isn't really like this. We were talking about in the break about Merleau-Ponty, and I think one thing is that, and we just got a baby, 3 months old, and it seems to me that intersubjectivity is really central. So I think there's some sort of evidence. There's this woman at Portsmouth called Reddy, Indian woman, who pushes this. There's people in Copenhagen. People know they've got the Centre of Subjectivity Studies in Copenhagen, with Dan Zahavi runs it. They had a big grant of about 15 universities in Europe doing a big project on intersubjectivity and the primacy of intersubjectivity. So like when you're growing up, in some sense, your relationship to your mother, the mother-baby relationship, that the child is capable of understanding this sort of intersubjectivity before maybe they're capable of object recognition. Yeah, so this is, as someone who likes embodied cognition, one person I really like is Piaget, and in Uzi's kind of, Marc Picard is sort of Piagetian, and I think, I mean, there's arguments about to what degree babies are capable of recognizing objects. But the Cartesian kind of tradition says, first of all, we're capable of recognizing objects. And then we have to infer the existence of subjects. And I think we've got good reasons to think that the kind of, for human beings, this sort of intersubjectivity, the IU relationship is prior to the object relationship. Yeah. The recognizing object is a sort of an achievement, and that the intersubjective relationship is more fundamental, that the IU relationship comes first. Now, this sort of thing, talking about the kind of primacy of intersubjectivity, I think Ryle was kind of, yeah, his English sensibilities, his the Oxford Common Room of the 1950s would be, oh, we can't talk about that. It sounds too kind of naughty and French. But I think that's the direction I think one might want to go. But listen, according to the Cartesian, that only our bodies can meet. But that's not right. Yeah, I think that he doesn't talk about it in these terms. I think that's the sort of thought behind it, that kind of intersubjectivity maybe prior to the I-object relationship. It's not first of all, I recognize you as an object, your body as an object, and then infer the existence of the mind. And I think in developmental terms, we haven't got good evidence that babies, first of all, recognize the body, and then recognize and then infer the subject. That I think that the mother and the baby maybe form a sort of we. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's my take. Okay, so that's the first section. I think on page 5, that when he's talking about the mental, we've got knowing, believing, but we've got guessing, hoping, dreaming, intending, shirking, being amused. His conception, the sort of language he uses for the mental, I think one of the things he sort of stresses is that our mentalistic vocabulary is very broad. I think one of the things that happened in analytic philosophy after the 50s is our vocabulary got very shrunk. You know, we just have beliefs and desires. And then when we're talking about the mental, that's really central. And I think Ryle isn't like this. Okay, that's section 1. Section 2, we've got this very famous discussion of the category mistake. I guess we have an obligation to read this. Does someone want to read the category mistake passage? Okay. Oh, you came a bit late, so you can read this one. Then you can read the next one. This is on page 6.
Okay, I'm starting from
A foreigner.
I'm sorry,
A foreigner. A Turk. An innocent Turk comes to Oxford. I mean, this is like, well, let's laugh at the foreigner. We have the foreigner who comes to Oxford, doesn't understand things. He doesn't understand cricket. Oh dear. What a silly foreigner. I think you can imagine this is. Okay.
A foreigner visiting Oxford or Cambridge for the first time is shown a number of colleges, libraries, playing fields, museums, scientific departments, and administrative offices. He then asks, but where is the university? I have seen where the members of the colleges live, where the registry works, where the scientists experiment, and the rest. But I have not yet seen the university in which reside and work the members of your university. It has done to be explained to him that the university
Explained to him.
Yes.
Yeah,
that the university is not another collateral institution, some ulterior counterpart to the colleges, libraries, and offices he has seen. The university is just a way in which all that he has already seen is organized. When they are seen and when their coordination is understood, the university has been seen. His mistake lay in his innocent assumption that it was correct to speak of Christ Church, the Bodleian Library, the Ashmolean Museum, and the university, to speak that as if the university stood for an extra member of the class of which these other units are members.
Yeah, so that's basically the category mistake. That we've seen a bunch of buildings and things, and then we think the university is just another thing in the collection. And I think what's important here is that there is the university. He's not saying there is no university. We're not denying the existence of Oxford University, but Oxford University is not another thing in addition to the colleges and blah, 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 blah. But what he says in terms of the metaphysics of what the university is, what is the university?
It's not some building, it's some building.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just the way in which that is already seen as organized. You've got the stuff and then you've got the way the stuff is organized. I think like one of the things that's driving Riley, classically trained, I think he did his undergrad in classics, it's sort of very Aristotelian. Yeah, so that you know, Descartes, you've got the mind and body as separate substances. What does Aristotle think about the relationship between the mind and the body, the mental?
The soul inhabits a particular body.
But what is the soul? What is, yeah. Well, what language does he use? Well, form and matter. Yeah, the soul is the form of the body. Yeah, so you've got the form matter distinction, and then of course within Aristotle, the big question is whether you can have matter without form, and whether you can have form without matter. Yeah, and so some Aristotelians who were more Platonist, who were more Cartesian, thought that form could exist without matter, like the Platonic ideas. A more embodied kind of Aristotelian is going to think that the mind is just the form of the body. Yeah, and if you get rid of the matter, the form is gone as well. Yeah, you've got the clay and you've got the statue. That's a particular type of form. All living things have a sort of organizational structure. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, but we cannot directly perceive the form, right? In here, we can directly perceive the universe.
Well, I mean, so we've just got some analogies here it's giving us at the moment. Yeah, we've got the relationship between the university and the colleges, etc. Here the relationship is between kind of organizational structure and physical things. The next example he gives is the army and the division. You've got the battalions, and here I guess you've just got a part-whole relationship. Yeah, so you've got category mistakes where you've got words for the parts and words for the whole, and then the mistake. Yeah. Now you might think, well, in this case, you can see one of the parts, and perceiving the parts, all the parts just is perceiving the whole. With the organizational structure, it's not so obvious. The other thing he gives is the British Constitution. So you've got the kind of political organization of society, and then you've got the Constitution. And of course, the British Constitution is unwritten. So once again, you've got something like organizational structure and the things governed by it. How do we fit this in with accounts of perception? Well, I think it's a kind of Rylean view of the mind. It's something like the form of the body. It's the way the body is structured. It's got to do with organizational stuff. And I think you're going to have to think that these sort of structural things are things that one can pick up on. Now, I suggested that these sort of structural things are best thought of adverbially. So you've got a type of activity that is organized in a certain way. So you've got how, I'm moving my body, and it's how I'm moving it. Yeah. And the intelligence, the mental has got to do with the how. And I guess in general, we don't have any problem perceiving hows. So I'm doing something quickly, I'm doing something slowly. Yeah. I'm doing something intentionally. It's just, in some sense, it's just another how. It's how I'm doing it. It's how it's being. So I guess though that he's going to be committed to the idea that when you've got something that has a structural organization, this is going to manifest itself in the behavior of the institution. And then maybe one is able to see this in action. So you can't see the Constitution, but you can see the Constitution in action. Yeah, but I guess you can see the Constitution in action. So when Parliament is opened, yeah, in some sense, what you're seeing is the Constitution in action. Yeah.
Would you say that this can also be used to, highlight where he is different from like a pure behavioralist picture, where like, when you see someone, you know, and you perceive their intention, you're not like when you just look at the behavior, and if you ask where is the intention or where is the anger, you're, you know, falling into the same mistake. It is a different category, but you still can't perceive it through that.
Okay, so I think that's right. And I think this is helping me to transition onto chapter 2, because that's what chapter 2 is sort of about. So I take it that he thinks the relationship between the mental and the behavior is not like the relationship between cause and effect. Yeah, we've got 2 questions, and then I'll...
Am I wrong to think that by getting the whole inverse analogy, I was expecting to say that all of the inverse emerges from some of the institutions, emergent behavior? I was getting the whole chapter expecting to say that, like in terms of Hofstadter's fiction of the mind infuses like the in his book, I'm a Spanish book, he says that all living things have a certain amount of, let's say, consciousness points, and it works like the sanctified paradox. It just emerges from the more you institutions of the university you have, the more conscious the mind becomes, the more universe the universe becomes.
Yeah, so one thing is, I don't think that he wants to say that the relationship between the body and the mind, or the physical and the mental, is like the relationship between the colleges and the university. Yeah. What he's doing with this example is just giving us some examples of category mistakes. Yeah. So I don't think he's committing himself in any way to the idea that the kind of mental physical relationship is analogous to the university colleges relationship. Having said that, there is a bit of an analogy. Yeah, that the relationship between the colleges and the university is not, as he suggests, is not the kind of just a mere part-whole relationship. Yeah, because what the university is something that's an organizational structure. The relationship between the kind of various institutions that make up the British state and the Constitution. And that's interesting because the institutions that make up the British state themselves are not physical things. That each of these institutions is something like the university. It's a sort of organizational structure. And then we have the kind of organizational structure of the organizational structure. And so the Constitution, and I think one thing that's interesting about the Constitution is the relationship between the Constitution and the elements. Yeah, so the Constitution governs the relationship between the various institutions. Yeah, between the Houses of Parliament, the House of Lords, the Executive, the Queen. How do all of these institutions relate to each other? The Constitution sort of governs that. And it's a sort of normative governance. It's an account of how this relationship should be, ideally. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes people, overstep. Yeah, so it's not a description of how people do behave, but it's a sort of an account of ideally how this relationship should work that is realized imperfectly in day-to-day interaction. So I think that, so I think once again, we've got another example of a category mistake. And then to what degree is the relationship between the mental and the physical like the relationship between the Constitution and once again, I think there's some sort of analogy, but, and then I do think behind this, we've got this Aristotelian idea that we can think of as the mind, the form of the body. And then, if you're going to kind of go with this more embodied cognition sort of view, we might think that the form of the body has got to do with sort of the organized structure of this process of unfolding activity. Then we can understand it in terms of constraints and constraints on constraints. But it's something like the organizing structure, the constraints on the unfolding of behavior. So yeah, I think I've said all I can say about it. One more thing, and then I want to move on to this chapter 2. Yeah. Oh,
I was also
okay.
I was also about to ask about those. It's kind of like horizontal relationship, like emergence.
Yeah,
etc.
but I think,
So
but I think
same
it's not just a part-whole relationship, because it's more like the form-matter relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. What time is it now? How much? Okay. Tell me when it's, because I haven't. My only time device is on my phone, and I'm zooming. Okay. So we've done book chapter 1. Don't want to spend any more time on chapter 1. I want to focus on chapter 2, but there is one more quote from chapter 1 that sets up the scene. So according to the Cartesian picture, that there's an account of what it is that makes a behavior intelligent. Yeah, so this is on page 9. So do you want to read this? The second sentence on page 9. The difference between the human behaviors.
The difference between the human behaviors which we describe as intelligent and those which we describe as unintelligent must be a difference in their causation. So, while some movements of human tongues and limbs are the effects of mechanical causes, others must be the effects of non-mechanical causes. That is, some issue from movements of particles of matter, others from workings of the mind.
Yeah. So according to the Cartesian account, what makes something intelligent, what makes something intentional, is the fact that it has a certain causal history. Yeah, and this is the view this is one of the main views he wants to attack in chapter 2. Yeah, so the Cartesian thing that, okay, let's stick with intention. So this is the example that Ryle himself focuses on, with the example of the clown at the end of the section I gave you. Like, so what makes an action intentional? We might think that what it is that makes a bit of physical movement intentional. What is the Cartesian going to say? It was caused by an intention. Yeah. Yeah. What makes an action intentional is that it was caused by an intention. And what an intention is it's a sort of hidden mental act. So an intentional action is an action that's caused by an intention, a kind of deliberate action. You know, you have an intelligence, then you do it. Yeah. So what makes something intentional is the fact that it was caused by an intention. Now we haven't got long now, so I'm going to jump straight to the clown passage at the end. And then next class, when we're online, I do want to talk a little bit more about the beginning of chapter 2 and the stuff about inner speech and outer speech. I don't want to stay too long on it, and I want to talk about his account of the relationship between theory and practice. So for next week, we'll start next week. We're running a little bit behind, but I can deal with that. We'll talk a little bit more about Ryle, and then we're going to talk about Putnam and functionalism next. Well, I'll try and start. So this is on page 21. So page 21 now. So in the second paragraph, he starts talking about parent. Yeah. Why? Really, I think it's going on in this section. There's a potential problem for the Rylean account that the Cartesian is just going to say, hey, you can't explain it. So what's the problem with the parrot? Why might we think that the parrot is going to cause a problem for Ryle? Yeah.
Because parrot does not repeat that those words by understanding them and by intending to mean that.
Yeah. So we can have, and the clown as well is going to be exactly the same problem. We can have a form of behavior that sometimes we can say this is meaningful, other times no. So when I say, oh, what a pretty boy, I might mean it. This is something parrots say in England, for some reason. Yeah. If a parrot says it, the parrot doesn't mean anything. But we've got exactly the same form of behavior. So in some cases, a behavior we take to be the expression of something mental. In other cases, we don't. How do we explain that? How can the same behavior on different occasions, in one case be taken to be mental, in the other case not? And the sort of Cartesian answer is it's simple. That in one case, the behavior was caused by something mental. In the other case, it wasn't. So the parrot doesn't, in some sense, mean anything. When I say something, I mean it. And what that means is, first of all, I think of the meaning and then I say it. That's a sort of intellectualist picture. When I say something, I intend to mean something. There's something I'm trying to say. There's something mental. Yeah, so in one case, we're going to say take the behavior, the physical behavior to be the expression of something mental. In the other case, we're not. And the Cartesian is going to suggest that this gives clear evidence for the Cartesian picture, because the only way of explaining the difference is in terms of, in one case, we've got a type of cause that is mental, in the other case, we don't. So this is the second paragraph. Ryle sets up the problem. He says, of course, it's perfectly true that when we characterize as witty or tactful, and once again, when we're thinking about the mental, when we say that was witty, that was funny, that was clever, that when we think of speech like this, we are basically attributing mentality to others. Yeah? Not belief, desire ascription. That's not the thing he's most interested in. It's someone witty, I think. Yeah. We are not considering only the muscular movement which we witness. Yeah. A parrot might have made the same remark in the same situation, without our crediting it with a sense of humor. A lout may have done precisely what the tactful man did without thinking him tactful. But if one and the same vocal utterance is a smoke of humor from the humorist, but a mere noise response when issuing from a parrot, it's tempting to say that we are ascribing wit not to something that we hear, but to something else that we do not hear. Yeah? What distinguishes the parrot from the human being is that it's not in terms of what we hear, because in the sound is the same in both cases. So the intelligence can't be in the behavior. This is sort of thought. The intelligence must be in something behind the behavior that we don't see. We are accordingly tempted to say that what makes one audible or visible action witty, while another audibly or visibly similar action was not, is that the former was attended by another inaudible and invisible action, which was the real exercise of wit. Yeah, we've got this hidden internal wittiness that causes the external witty action. But to admit, as we must, that there may be no visible or audible difference between a tactful or witty act and a tactless or humorless one is not to admit that the difference is constituted by the performance or non-performance of some extra secret mental internal act. Yeah. So this is the problem. So we've got the problem set up. What's his solution? Well, he says the cleverness of the clown, this is I think a very important passage, may be exhibited in his trippings and tumblings. So a clown is always falling over. Think of Charlie Chaplin. And this is very skilled activity. It's deliberate. That Charlie Chaplin is deliberately almost falling over. Now, someone could be walking, someone could be walking down the stage and slip on a banana. That is actually funny. I was going to say that's not funny, but actually it depends who it is. But someone can trip accidentally. The clown is tripping, and we kind of admire the clown's skill, intelligence. Yeah, because the clown is doing it intentionally. He trips and tumbles just as clumsy people do, except that he trips and tumbles on purpose. Yeah, so the clown trips and tumbles on purpose. It's falling over on purpose. So the kind of Cartesian view is when you do something on purpose, there's two things. There's what you're doing, and then there's its internal purpose. There's an internal intention. And after much rehearsal at the golden moment, and when the children could see him, so as not to hurt himself, the spectators applaud his skill at seeming clumsy. But what they applaud is not some hidden performance executed in his head. It is his visible performance they admire. But, here's the answer, they admire it not for being an effect of any hidden internal cause, but for being the exercise of skill. Yeah. So the difference between a clown falling over on purpose and me tripping over as I'm going down the stairs, which isn't funny. It's only funny when other people trip. This is the thing about humor. It's only funny when other people fall over. That the clown, when the clown does it, it's an exercise of skill. Now, I think Rose's not so much interested in clowns. He's more interested in parrots and language. So with language, once again, now what differentiates the parrot from me is the parrot's funny and I'm not. No, what differentiates the parrot from me is that when I speak to you, I am in some sense exercising a skill. I have a capacity. I have capacity to speak English, and my behavior is a sort of exercise of this capacity. Yeah, so I mean, so the parrot's capacity is the exercise of a capacity. So I actually think that he's a bit down on animals. So he talks about the seal who's learned this routine, and I'm like, that's a cool seal. And he's just really dismissive of seals. Yeah. So I think but in some sense, yes, the parrot is exercising a capacity, but it's not the same capacity. So
how do you differentiate it's not being the same capacity?
So
Because one is aware of the fact that the person doing the falling over thing is clown, and that's acquired by some social interaction.
but the parrot,
That's the one.
yes. So the linguistic capacities are that we may admire the parrot's memory, but we don't think the parrot means something when the parrot says whatever it says.
But why don't we think that? Like,
Because
the car sensor is ready. But
yeah. So I would say that the parrot doesn't know how to speak English.
but I think it's more about like again like I think this is more like, for example, parrot does not have an eye contact, and we also observe parrot like speaking to when there's like nobody in the room, etc. Like if that's kind of like
but I would say
it's
that
not direct.
yeah, but I would say that the parrot, the difference between us and the parrot, I sort of agree with Riley here. The difference between us and parrots when we engage in the same behavior is the parrot doesn't know English. That's the difference. I mean, have you ever talked to a parrot? You talk to some students in Turkish, like when you're first learning English, it's like, is it really? I mean, there is a period where,
I guess you find out that the parrot doesn't know English by just testing it and
by interacting with it.
But asking it questions, and at some point it won't be able to answer grammatically or to repeat.
Yeah, so this chapter is about the difference between knowing how and knowing that. And the difference, I mean, once again, we can say in these Wittgensteinian terms, that like when I talk to you in English, you sort of know how to respond. And that's a sort of capacity you have. Whereas the parrot doesn't know how to go on. So
I'm sorry, that astronomical just
Yeah.
showed us like parrots video that is actually like communicable. So I think if I am able to find it, I will.
yeah, no, I know this parrot that kind of can count up to 10.
No, it's not like that. It's like really emotional story where like he was going to die and said like take care or something like that. Something that is like so that it's intentional, but like, it's like a side story.
Yeah. So one thing is I think that there are some animals that are clearly capable of some sort of linguistic communication. So I would say that the parrot he's talking about isn't. Yeah. So like you've got a very stupid parrot. Yeah. But yeah, I think that there are, through training, there are some non-human animals that are quite. What time is it now? Okay, so
Can we exemplify the science from experiment with this phenomena, like that really similar in terms of the subject?
I would say that he might be subject to the sort of worry because so one thing I'd say about our linguistic know-how is we're going to read some Tomasello, and I take it that our linguistic know-how involves a capacity to interact and engage in certain, like things like pointing and joint attention. So we're able to talk about things and interact with things in the world. And so I guess that our sort of linguistic know-how involves a capacity to engage to sculpt one another's joint attention. So I'm able to point to something and talk about this. And my sort of quite Wittgensteinian Tomasello type of influence is going to say, yes, that the difference is one of capacities, but these capacities are not ones that can be understood fully computationally, but they involve capacities for joint attention. We had a question here, and then Eunice.
I was just thinking that if you don't admire it, like the Chinese group was communicating, but just producing sounds.
Yeah.
So it's comparison, that's the word.
Yeah. Why don't you send this parrot? Because I'd like to see that. I like these cute animals doing clever stuff. Yeah, I mean, there are some sort of parrots that you had in England in the 50s that were really stupid. But these are the parrots he's talking about. The ones who just sit there and say, "Who's a pretty boy? Who's a pretty boy?" Yeah. But Eunice, you had it.
I was going to say that even if that parrot has some kind of intentionality, I mean, couldn't we say that it's not the same kind of intentionality because the web of interactions that parrot has, or web of knowledge, I mean, the ontology presupposes knowledge, or sorry, the ontology that his knowledge presupposes, that his language presupposes, is different than ours. So it's not the same kind of intentionality. Can't say that.
I mean, yeah, so are we talking about this parrot or are we talking about this really smart parrot? So I do think though that animals are capable, do have some sort of intentionality, that they do kind of have some point of view. I mean, my Tomasello-based understanding of language and our linguistic capacities puts joint attention there as really central. And that's where I think that this is the sort of type of capacity that most other animals lack. Yeah, it's not obvious, like with birds, when they're communicating with others, are they capable of joint intentionality? I don't know.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, crows are quite intelligent. Dogs, I think, have some sort of joint intentionality. So there's certain types of. So my view of language is
it's not possibly a sufficient condition.
Yeah. So one thing I'd say about language is that he focuses on individual capacities, whereas I take it with language. Ultimately, it's best understood as a kind of we capacity. So when we're having a conversation, that we've got capacity to do something, and this we capacity can't be decomposed into I capacities because of the role of joint attention. You can only really model joint attention by taking a kind of we perspective. You can't understand joint attention purely in terms of two sets of individual attention. If you're interested in this, there's this book by John Campbell, a good reference of consciousness. He's quite cool. He gave the Jean Nicole lectures a couple of years ago. Okay, bye. Okay, yeah.
Maybe we just